with you again, our friends. Maureen Diaz again. This week, we're doing something a little bit different. I am at the Acres USA Conference in Covington, Kentucky. And I'm here on behalf of Weston A. Price Foundation, but it's time to do our show. So I've talked to a couple of people, asked them to come on board and talk with us today about some important topics. To begin with, we're going to talk with Fred Miller from, say the town, Bremen, Ohio. Indiana. I'm sorry, I knew that. Fred is a farmer, and he stopped by our booth yesterday, and we had a nice talk about regenerative farming and sustainable agriculture. And because this is an integral aspect of what we do, both with the Weston A. Price Foundation and God's Good Table, I wanted to talk about that because really the principles of regenerative agriculture are actually God-given principles. So we talk a lot about God-given principles for health and healing, but it all begins with how we treat the land and how we raise animals. Now, Fred and I are going to have a conversation. He's not going to be in the picture. He's Amish, and I can assure you he's not an ogre or anything like that. He's just here ready to talk, and he's quite articulate. So we're going to have a conversation. And I want to start with Fred. What is your background in agriculture?
Well, I grew up on a small farm, and although we've always rented it out, I was still active on the farm. We always had the family cow and animals on the farm, so I was very familiar with it ever since, I was able to do chores. And then I worked for my brother-in-law, which was very intensive, and he was a distance from where we lived at home. And I absolutely hated working on his farm because I was a kid. And I thought, my friends are home having fun, and here I am just slaving away. But as I grew older, I realized, wow, there was a lot of value in it. And I actually longed for that. And I had an interest in it. And I realized that done me more good than anything in my life has done. So I thanked my brother-in-law already to make me work and to show me the fundamentals. So
it's interesting because most English people think of Amish as just farmers, but not all Amish are farmers.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so I have worked in the industrial world for many years, the RV world, and of course in the woodworking industry, which I'm still involved in somewhat. So.
Okay.
But then I had the opportunity about 4 years ago to purchase my uncle's farm. He's aging, has no children of his own, and we offered, I'll buy the farm, and we'll be there for you as you age. And but if I do, I knew immediately I would switch to regenerative practices. So that's how I got started.
And you knew that because?
Well, I've had an interest in it for years, and because I started realizing as I had children and grandchildren, it was quite obvious what was happening to our health, and I realized the correlation and the relation between our soil health and our health, and how it's impossible to have healthy animals, healthy people on unhealthy soil. So I've done a lot of research on my own and visited conferences, and that's how I gained my knowledge and my interest in it. So.
Okay. And I believe 100% you're correct that overall health begins in the soil. And God created everything perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't give us soil to be sprayed with chemicals, and then chemicals to kill everything, and then chemicals that will grow a limited amount of food in a chemical dependent system, which not only is toxic but devoid of nutrients. And so I know for years as I've driven through the countryside, and some areas are worse than others, but for instance, I would go back and forth between Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and along the turnpike are thousands and thousands of acres of conventional crop fields, and they're dependent upon irrigation, and and you see the chemicals being sprayed up and down, and then at the end of a growing season, you see everything just lying there dead but not decaying, which is indicative of every life form is supposed to decay to keep the cycle going for future generations. But did you see that same thing, that same issue where farmers were farming conventionally using chemicals and everything was dead and things didn't break down? And to me, it doesn't even make fiscal sense.
Right.
I don't understand why people think that conventional farming, which requires large equipment, massive input of chemicals, and then you're doing all of the planting and all of the harvesting, all of the everything, instead of letting animals do it. So that's just another aspect. But you remove animals from the equation, and really you take God's principles out of the equation, and nothing can really live. So even if you produce a crop, the crop is toxic and devoid of nutrients. So what good is it?
Exactly. And I can relate to that. And the story goes back a while before I ever realized that I'd be purchasing the farm. I lived beside it, and I seen how extractive this commercial farming is. And so for one example is the farmer, and I don't. It's just reality. The farmer, for instance, if he had a corn crop, he would remove all the residue, the corn stalks, and which there goes all the carbon, and it would never be reintroduced to the farm. And I made the comment, which may have been somewhat unprofessional, but I made the comment, if that'd be my farmer, he'd have an eye-opener, because that is not, I would not tolerate that. Well, as it turns out, he become my farmer, and his philosophy was so different. And to relate to what you said, the soil is dead, and the residue actually just stayed laying there. And so he said, well, yeah, we need to remove this residue, because if we don't, it'll just mold and it'll become toxic. And he was right. That's true. But what needs to happen, well, you need to go back and put life back in the soil, so that, and this residue is what the biology needs to survive and to live on. And so
right, exactly. I was yesterday, the talk that I gave, were you in on the gardening talk?
I was.
Okay, so in there I talked about Paul Gauchi. I can never know if I say his name right, but with the Back to Eden gardening method. But he talks about observing nature, the way that God created everything to work. That he talks about starting a garden bed in the fall, because in the fall you watch the layers of leaves and the twigs and all of the residue from whatever has been growing, either that we planted or that God planted. It falls to the ground. And if that ground is not dead, if it is full of microbes the way it's supposed to be, and fungi, then everything just returns to the soil. It's just a constant regenerative circular process.
It's a beautiful process, and I use that as well on the farm. So I have beef cattle that I house in a hoop structure, and it's extremely comfortable for them during the winter. I feed them in there, and of course all their residue remains in there, and I intentionally leave it build, during the winter time. That is then composted, and in the fall, when the leaves begin to fall, that's when you put this back out on the fields. And guess what? By now, it's practically gone again.
Yeah,
you
because
hardly
it's dirt.
It's dirt. It's been composted, and the microorganisms love it, and that's what supplies their diet.
Yeah,
and
that's
their livelihood. So
that's how it's supposed to be. I know Joel Salatin puts his cattle in a barn, in an open air barn for the winter, and he just keeps laying down straw bedding.
Exactly.
So it composts, just like you're talking about, and it generates heat, so it doesn't get real cold for the animals.
Correct.
And it's constantly decomposing, and then he puts the pigs in the spring to rototill.
Aerated, yes.
Yeah, and of course he's tossing out some corn so that they're motivated to dig, but it's such a beautiful, simple process that works.
Correct, and if you have the proper carbon to nitrogen ratio in this manure, there's no smell.
Right.
And the pathogens, the microbes are stronger than the harmful pathogens. So
everything
it's
is in balance.
It's correct.
Yeah, and toxins neutralize with the composting. So even if there's something in there that shouldn't be, the microbes take care of it.
Correct. So there's definitely pathogens that can be in manure, but by composting in the spring, and it'll go through its heat cycle and that, and there's many of them that I don't even know, but I know, for instance, like Clostridium, that can actually grow in soil. So if that's still alive and you spread it on your fields, that can continue to grow. But if it goes through a composting, a heat cycle, that will kill those pathogens. So it's such a perfect cycle.
That is so cool. That is so neat. I wonder if that has something to do also with why just the heat generating. I've seen lots of pictures and videos of old style European farms where the farmers actually lived above the barn. Like
I visited those barns, yes.
That would be so neat to see. I'd love to see that. But that would be producing actually heat for the people above, and it would not smell.
Correct.
That's fascinating.
Right. And I just had the evening before I left for the conference here, I had a person stopping in that wanted to buy some piglets. He was excited about raising his own, and we got into our barn, and he said, "Well, it doesn't even smell in here." And I just chuckled, and I said, "No, and it shouldn't. If it does, that means you don't have the right carbon to nitrogen ratio." So I said, "Just keep them bedded. They won't smell."
Because all you have to do is just keep putting down straw or wood chips or something.
Correct. Or it could be as simple as leaves or sawdust or something. So if it stinks, it's just the smell of mismanagement.
That's a very clear way of putting it.
Yes.
But it shouldn't, and we don't need more chemicals or anything else to change that. We just need to do simple things to keep the ratio carbon to, say it again, it's carbon to nitrogen. Nitrogen builds leaves. Carbon builds
roots.
Yeah, really important.
Or plants,
Yeah, plants generally. So you were drawn to regenerative agriculture then, and you told me a story yesterday about your uncle saying something about good year for hay.
Oh, yes.
Tell
Okay.
that story.
Yes. So my uncle's in 83, and of course I try to be sensitive to his past as well, because he grew up, when fertilizers, or his dad, when fertilizers were still introduced. And if I was him, I would have done the very same thing. I thought this
sounded good.
Yeah, this is great. So at 83 years old, it's hard to change your paradigm. And so without saying, okay, so you've been doing it wrong for 60 years here, we're going to change,
Yeah.
So gradually, immediately I've implemented like microbes and hydrolyzed, biostimulants and that on the pastures. And so I just implemented what I had learned, even from Joel Salatin. I visited his farms and that. And so I asked my uncle, so how many cows have you had on here, on this pasture? And this pasture was pasture for 80 years already. So it's the same pasture. Nothing has changed. And so I asked him a few questions, did you ever put chemical fertilizers on here? And he said, no, we just, spread our manure on there. And he said, oh, okay, so Dad and I, we've always had 4 or 5 cattle on our pasture.
Yeah.
And a few horses, and that supported them. And so I knew right away from the literature that I read, so if I manage this, I can double the capacity of it. So I had 8 cattle, mama cows for calving, and I have some sheep and horses and that. So I immediately but started, using those practices. And so the beginning of the second year, my uncle, which has looked at these fields for 80 years, commented that, well, this sure is a great spring for pasture, isn't it? And I said, well, yeah, I think it's pretty good. And my son, which was 13 at the time, had commented that, what do you think Uncle will say when he sees how lush this pasture is? And I said, well, he'll probably be happy, but maybe it's always this lush. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm carefully optimistic or cautiously optimistic.
Yeah.
And so, a few months later, he commented again that, boy, this is just a really good spring for pasture. And I told my older son, I think he's deceived by what he's seeing, because he's looked at this field for 60 years now that he's been responsible for it, and he's gauging the season and the conditions by what he's seeing. And I actually think it's the regenerative practices that we're starting to see a change. And so I said, I'm going to ask some of the other farmers in the area that do pasture. And I inquired, and they said, oh, no, it's an average year, probably. It's not above average. And then about midsummer, he walks out and he says, I have never had pasture the way you have pasture. So I thought, okay, I can put that worry to rest. I think these practices are working. So, and of course, then you can always improve after each year, as you can go. So.
What do you think that what made the biggest differences then? The changes?
Managing the rotational or the adaptive grazing has to be a huge contributor to it. But then, the microbes and the foliar feeds. So, I always had the wrong impression. I always thought you have to have good soil to have good plants. Well, before you can have good soil, you have to have good plants. So if they're stuck in this poor cycle, you have to foliar feed. To get them to photosynthesize, and then is when the biology in the soil begins to benefit more. And so this always keeps increasing.
It is to me very interesting that when we follow the principles that God laid out, which includes utilizing animals on land, but not just putting them out in a pasture and letting them graze everywhere they want, and then they eat what they want and they don't eat what they don't want, and you end up with a very imbalanced system, which is probably the way that your farm was under your uncle's management then, I'm guessing. But when you mimic nature, God's design, you notice that animals, in particular things like cattle and sheep and goats, they move in what Joel calls mob grazing.
Right.
They move in groups and they just continue to move. If you intentionally move them along a plot of land where they don't have constant access to the whole thing, but they have limited access every day or every couple of days to where they're eating everything that's not poisonous, hopefully, which isn't a major problem on well-managed pasture anyway. So they're eating everything that they should be eating, and it should be not just alfalfa or timothy hay, but it should be a mixture, a natural, beautiful mixture of herbs and grasses. And then you move them on, and they're also loosening the soil with their feet or their hooves, and then depositing their food for the soil, complete with microbes.
And a ruminant like that, it's loaded with microbes. They're waste, Yeah. So if you're moving them along, if you just allow them access to the whole field, they'll go to the most comfortable spot to lay down every time. So they'll lay down. That's what a cow does. The first thing she does when she gets up, poops, pees. So she puts all her microbes down
in one spot,
and even pathogens. Goes out to graze, comes back and lays right back into them. And so, I think even any conventional vet will tell you, keep them moving to break that worm cycle. So when you keep them moving, they're not compiling all these nutrients in one spot, which actually finally creates a dead zone. So they're spreading it. And so the I've come to the realization that, speaking of God's creation and the way He designed it, it's hard to imagine how many creatures and the whole economy in the soil. It's the more I learn, the more I realize it's like the spiritual world. What you see is just a fraction of actually what's there. So now, since I've practiced this and I realize the importance of it, now I'm as concerned about the livestock in the soil as I am about the livestock on the soil.
Yeah.
So
livestock in the soil, meaning all the microbes.
Right, because without a healthy supply, whatever's on top isn't healthy either. So, and I've really noticed it on animal health. I mean, knock on wood, but I have not had a vet bill since. And I know that farm specifically, and even some of the same cattle, I still have some of the same genetics. Historically, fly season, July, on that farm, they'd end up with pink eye. Well, that's fairly easy to remediate with the proper nutrition and the proper cycles. And that has vanished. So, and that health, I see it in the animals, but that can be a contributor to our own health as well. So
it does directly contribute, I think, to our own health.
I believe so, yes.
I like to think or use the phrase that you are what you eats. And that we could say that over and over and over again, because if you're grazing cattle on an overworked pasture and they have parasites because of just what you described, and they are lacking nutrition because they're only getting a few plants, and the soil is devitalized, then if I eat that animal, it's not going to have nearly the nutrition that it should have, and it also will be much more prone towards illness.
Correct.
And sometimes fertility problems and things like that too. So we just want to keep going back to I can say nature, but God created nature. If we just pay attention to how He created things to work.
And work with nature.
And work with instead of against. And using chemicals is working against.
Correct. And I can't say that there's never, ever a time to use chemicals. I mean, if there's an extreme situation, I probably would if I'd have to, but I would immediately try to offset that again somehow. I mean, fortunately, I've never had to, but...
I can't even think of a situation.
I guess I don't either, but let's say like a medication. If I have a cow that's down and I know this cow is going to die tomorrow if I don't use whatever, an antibiotic or whatever, I would use it.
Yeah.
But I would immediately try to mitigate the bad effects of that.
I remember having to give a milk cow after she freshened. I had to give her, is it calcium?
Probably.
Yeah, and she got right back up and was fine. But that wasn't actually chemical, but it was an assistance. And she needed it at that point in time. I think she was an older cow. But you're producing food for people and for animals.
Yes, and I've had good results with the beef. That I was cautiously optimistic about the beef, and I've had some really good reviews on that. And we have chickens on this regenerative pasture as well, which can be an asset to the pasture.
Oh, yeah.
And I've had some really great comments, and I'm just small scale, but we purchased 200 hens, laying hens.
Yeah.
And so I have some customers that come back and say, wow, what are you feeding these hens? Because I can eat these eggs. And they don't affect me negatively like normal,
store-bought eggs.
And it's not that they dislike eggs, they love them, but they can't tolerate them for whatever reason that their condition is in.
I've heard that quite a few times.
Yes, and so we've got a few of these watchdogs out there that are watching us intentionally, and we want them to because we want to know if there's changes. Those people that are sensitive to the taste and the quality of the egg, that's who we need feedback from.
Yeah.
So
sometimes it's soy in the feed, and people are sensitive to the soy.
right, and so we've added a load of natural minerals into the feed, and like instead of calcium carbonate, which is typically in chicken feed, not very digestible, we use aragonite calcium, which is more digestible.
Yeah.
You can actually control the hardness of the shell by feeding it, and so we've got good reviews on that. It's just exciting to see that you're actually doing something for the good of people,
Yeah.
the population. So
On the chickens and egg laying, do you have any roosters?
I do. We have 4 actually with those, and for more than one reason. I don't know for sure. I've heard there's nutritional benefits by having fertile
believe
eggs.
there are.
I could easily believe that because that's natural,
Yeah.
but also for predation like hawks.
Yeah.
And I've seen this happening in our flocks. A rooster will raise a fit and he'll be more aggressive if there's a hawk in the area. So he's almost like a watchdog.
And he calms the hens down because they feel safer.
I believe so, yes.
So you might get more eggs out of them that way.
Sure. And another thing that I've seen, that I've just been in the last 2 weeks, I've been approached by 4 different individuals right in our area that have asked, "Are your hens still laying?" And I said, "Well, yeah, fortunately they haven't dropped in production." And I honestly expected them to, because historically, usually this time of the year when the days become shorter and colder, and they'll start dropping, and they haven't yet. And all 4, the family members and friends said, "Well, our chickens aren't laying anymore. What are you feeding?" And they said, "Could we come and get some of your feed?" And of course, that's fine with me if they do. So now I'm curious to see if they feed a better quality feed, of not only the hens' health will be better, but also a better egg.
Yeah.
My best theory at this point is, I guess the chickens are more healthy and they haven't dropped production.
That's really neat because that doesn't happen very often. Usually spring, fall, the chickens molt and production drops off. I only have a few chickens, and I was away. I can tell you that they will drop production when they don't get fed enough.
Oh yeah, sure.
But mine don't like the oats in their feed, but they'll eat the oat grass that sprouts from that. So fortunately, they always have something to eat. But as soon as I got back and they started to have more corn and such, and I just feed an organic feed, then their production immediately came right back up. But I was surprised because even on our actual farm, they did drop off. They never quit entirely, but our production slowed twice a year.
Okay.
So that's really neat that you're not seeing.
I would expect, though, that once the ground is fully snow covered, I would have to believe they'll taper off.
Yeah. Next year. I want to know. I want to know if that happens. But well, this is an interesting conversation. It's been an interesting topic. Fred is very articulate, and he struck me yesterday in a conversation that we had, which is why I asked him to talk with me today. But regenerative agriculture is a topic that I think is so very important. And I'm not talking organic, not even sustainable. Although regenerative farming is organic and sustainable.
Correct.
But it's beyond all of that. And I think it's super important that we go back to that, because just like with our human health, if we go back to God's design, we are continually feeding the earth, feeding the soil, rejuvenating, building strong and healthy ecosystems, both we use that word a lot, but we are an ecosystem, and our microbiome is an ecosystem. What we have going on out where our food is being produced directly affects our bodies as well. So that's why I wanted to talk about that, and I'm really grateful to you, Fred, for having this conversation. We will in the future be going into, I'll talk and show about the practices that I use to raise food in my 3 or 4 different atmospheres of gardening. And we'll visit some farms and we'll look at some practices that people are using and seeing the results. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye to Fred, and then we're going to walk out into the exhibit hall, just say hello, and then we're going to walk over to Nasha Winters, who is signing her book right now, The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. But we're going to talk with her and talk a little bit about alternative healing modalities, and especially probably we'll talk a little bit about cancer. So we're going to start walking, but Fred, thank you.
Thank you
very much. Thank you very much.
Glad I could share.
I'm glad you were willing to share. That was wonderful. Okay, and now we're just going to walk on out here, and thank you. I'll see you in a bit. Okay. So this is not a huge conference, but it is a really interesting conference that I've attended many times, spoken at a few. And one of those things that I spoke about yesterday was my super easy, regenerative, and productive gardening methods. So we're going to do a show about that later. But right now, let's see if I can kind of give you an image. So, all right, we'll bring it back around. People from all over the country come to this conference to hello, Mr. Will.
Hello, how are you?
Here's Will Harris. Say hi.
Hello, how are you?
Thank you. I'll talk to you later. Okay, Will Harris from White Oak Pastures down in coastal Georgia. He's pretty well known. I'm looking for Nasha, and I see where she should be. But we'll just walk. Something.
Structure that per farmer, per field, per crop, per year.
This conference is just all about regenerative agriculture.
Tells you a story. You want to read a story of what is going with your field.
Here's the bookstore.
And also want to have a better context. Like, what was the weather like in that year that the harvest was so good on that field? So structure is
I found Nasha.
excuse me. Part of the map. Then structure the data, and then prepare the data, interpret the data, and it's
But all of these people are waiting. I get my camera to follow where I want it to follow, so let's come back here.
Do you want this to you?
I will come back, Nasha. We'll come back and we'll record something when everyone's done.
Thank you.
So we'll end for now, and I'll record something with her, and we'll put it up in the next couple of days. But Nasha is a really, really fascinating person. She's at drnasha.com. She wrote The Metabolic Approach to Cancer, and she just has a fascinating take on helping our bodies to heal without chemicals, but just using physically regenerative principles really for the human being. So that's it.
And that drove the development
I need
of
to say hello though to hello Peter.
is about
There's my friend Peter from Canada. Wait a minute here. From
and
not
monitoring and
Saskatchewan
planning.
and not Ontario, but Alberta.
Our promises to
Like
farmers
where one of our favorite shows, Heartland.
Yes. Are you going to be over there later?
I am.
I still want to see you and get that stuff arranged.
Okay, I'll be over there.
Okay.
So, okay.
And what we tell
Will you hold it?
offer
Will you hold it?
We're just going to say hi briefly to
Well,
to
look
Crazy
who's
Will.
here.
what
Beautiful.
we
Will Winters.
promise our farmers is more incentive for trade.
He said, see you in the funny papers. Yep, we see each other in the funny papers. So that's it for today. I'm going to cut it off since Nasha's a little busy. But I look forward to sitting down and talking with her and getting that recorded, and then I'll add it up later. So from Covington, Kentucky, and the Kentucky, I don't remember, it's a convention center in Covington, and the Acres USA Conference. I'm signing off for today. Thanks for tuning in. Bye, everybody.
The first one, seasons of evolution. So farming is